Well, as we said at the top of the program, one of the most anticipated dates, or perhaps a date he didn't want to see arrive in the Prime Minister's calendar, is here today, the 30th consecutive news poll loss. One of those measurements used by Malcolm Turnbull, as I said, to justify his challenge to Tony Abbott's leadership, and a justification he now says that he regrets. There is no challenger to apply the same negative news poll test to the PM this time, but the party is still dealing with internal divisions, a real battle over the soul of the party. So with the federal election about 12 months away, how worried should the government be about the polls, or is it simply a matter of holding its nerve?
It is the political own goal, 2.5 years in the making.
Malcolm Turnbull now says he regrets saying that...
Malcolm Turnbull has admitted he deeply regrets giving 30...
Polls come and polls go. 30 losses in a row, though, is impossible to ignore.
We have lost 30 news polls in a row. It is clear that the people have made up their mind about Mr Abbott's leadership.
Remember, it was Malcolm Turnbull who set this benchmark when he ousted Tony Abbott.
And I regret making those remarks at the time.
But bad polls don't necessarily mean political death. Look at this headline from the 1980s. John Howard had been in and out of the Liberal leadership. He was the most unpopular political figure in the country. Even he conceded that political resurrection would be miraculous.
Oh, that's Lazarus with a triple bypass. I mean, really, break it down.
But return he did, and he governed for more than a decade, Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister. Now he has some advice for the current PM and the embattled Liberal Party.
Just remember that you're carrying the hopes and aspirations of millions of supporters around the country, and they want you to work together, they want you to bury differences.
But Malcolm Turnbull isn't being stalked just by the public or the opposition.
I think the crowd got onto the fact that he's here. They must have seen that shot on the scoreboard.
His enemies are closer to home. He battles Conservatives who believe the Prime Minister has sold out the soul of the party. The spectre of Tony Abbott still haunts the coalition. He knows better than most that bad polls can cost you your job. He may also believe in political resurrections. Well, Amanda Vanstone is a former Liberal Senator for South Australia and the former Minister for Immigration. Tim Wilson is the Liberal member for Goldstein, and David Alexander is a former senior advisor to Peter Costello. He now works with the lobbying firm Barton Deakin. Nice to have all of you with us. Amanda, I did have a chuckle because I was reading what you've written about. You know what I'm going to say.
Yeah, I do.
You were going to have a holiday today from electronic media to avoid all this babble about news polls. Look, I agree with you on the babble, and that's what a lot of it is. But 30 polls, given the what the Prime Minister had said before, the benchmark he'd set, is there a deeper rot here?
No, look, I don't think there is. I mean, Abbott took us to a very unattractive place, and so Malcolm's had to climb out of that. And I think that's happening. I mean, you know, we got 400,000 jobs in the last year. That's 4 times as many as under Labor. Business confidence is up. The biff of politics has stopped that Australians said they were sick of. You know, we've now got a leader that operates in, if you like, a more civilised fashion, but not weak. I mean, he took on Trump. His first meeting with Trump wasn't one that, over the phone, that Trump welcomed. And that showed that Malcolm was prepared to say, well, we're a good friend of the states, but we're not a pushover. So I think this is washing through. It just takes time to get through to the electorate. Can I just say something about the 30 poll thing? Look, he did say that. There's no point in beating around the bush.
No, and he says he regrets that as well, using
sure,
that as a benchmark.
Sure, but look, just in case anyone ever goes to the pub for a counter meal, and you say, look, I'll have the steak, chips and salad, thanks, and the waiter or waitress comes up and you get a plate of chips, and you say, hold on, I ordered steak, salad and chips, and they get surly and say, but didn't you say you wanted chips? You say, well, yeah, I did say that, but no, you said you wanted chips, and chips you've got. Now, that's what's happening with this 30 poll thing. It was a part of a broader statement. It's taken out of perspective. You know, it's got to be dealt with, I know, but let's keep a bit of perspective on this.
Well, look, I might just work with that analogy there of the steak, salad and chips and steak and the rest of it, Tim Wilson, because Is there a case here that people thought with Malcolm Turnbull, and there was a bump in the polls when he took over, that they were getting the full meal, the steak, chips and the salad, and the steak's been missing? That he hasn't followed through on many of the things that they weren't getting the Malcolm Turnbull they thought they were going to get?
Well, I think if people were rusted on Tony Abbott supporters, of course they're going to prosecute that. I get an email periodically from somebody at bringbackabbott@gmail.com who always tries to make these points. But the truth is, Dan, I wasn't there as a parliamentarian when this happened, and frankly it's not the benchmark of leadership that I would have set, and it's not the one that I take as a test today either. I don't think it is the foundations of how a government should be run, how leadership should be decided, and particularly the leadership of a nation should be decided. The leadership of a nation should be decided firstly on obviously who was elected, but then the reform agenda they're driving to actually build Australia's future. And the reality is the government is actually delivering. It's not just delivering good job numbers, it's delivering, as Amanda went on about, business confidence. But over this budget and hopefully up to the next federal election, we'll be sending a clear message about the type of country we want to be. And that's actually what Australians want.
Look, I'll just stay with you on this and then come to David. Look, I hear you on this. I hear what Amanda had to say, but the public's not necessarily hearing it because there are 30 poor polls here. And even on the preferred Prime Minister number, where Malcolm Turnbull had enjoyed a handy lead over Bill Shorten, that's been lessening too. And the word that I keep hearing from people who really don't necessarily talk about the polls or pay a lot of attention to them, but the word I often hear, though, Tim, is disappointed. They don't necessarily dislike the Prime Minister, they're disappointed in him. How does he turn that around?
Well, firstly, I think people do. You're right. People do actually like the Prime Minister, and I think they give him a general disposition, that he is trying to do the right thing. I think the truth is we live in a consumer culture these days where people want instant gratification, instant hits. So if they're looking for an immediate solution to a problem, no one's going to be able to offer it. Malcolm Turnbull isn't going to be able to. Tony Abbott isn't going to be able to. Whoever the next Prime Minister, hopefully well off into the future, is not going to be able to deliver that. What people want is the Prime Minister to slowly and methodically work through the problems that the country faces and build solutions, as it is doing so on energy, around the National Energy Guarantee, as it around issues around tax and creating jobs and investment for the 21st century. But none of these things are going to give you an instant hit. None of it's going to be an overnight success. And actually, I think what people are going to realise as time goes on is firstly that the Prime Minister has a methodical pathway, as the government does, of achievements. But then when you look at the quick fixes and the sugar rushes that Labor are promising, that always ends up with a form of political diabetes, particularly in terms of burdensome debt and particularly on future generations.
Stan, when you have a minute.
Just quickly, then I'll come to David Alex. I don't want to leave you out of this statement, but Amanda does want to speak.
Well, look, you mentioned about disaffected people within the Liberal Party, within the party members, and you're referring, I think, to the more conservative members. Look, there's only a few of those who are particularly disaffected, and they centre around people who would have preferred Abbott to stay. And can I just say, I think the vote in the same-sex marriage postal vote should have showed the people in Warringah and the people in Menzies, the people in Warringah and Menzies showed their members that the members are out of touch. So they might be disaffected, but they're out of touch with real Australia.
David, what would your advice be to Malcolm Turnbull at the moment, who's clearly, he's set the benchmark, he hasn't passed his own test? What would you be saying to him?
Well, I think firstly, it's good to be over this 30 news poll hump, which has been a bit of a distraction. Don't panic. My abiding memory through the Howard years was being under the 50, for most of the time each term, and then coming good at the end. And the position we're in now is, of course, behind, but it's well within striking distance coming into the final straight. So keep the fundamentals right. Look through the final year as a long run-up to the final event, because, as we know, you can't fatten the pig on market day. He's got to think deeply about how to frame the budget, which is the last big set-piece policy announcement, and then probably hone the messages a bit better. He's got to try and draw all of the strands of different policies in together to a coherent whole and look forward.
How long does it take, David, until those, particularly those who are sitting there in marginal seats, start to say this is getting too close for comfort? I mean, OK, you've passed 30, but if we get to, September, October, and there hasn't been a shift, and you've had the budget and you haven't got a post-budget bump, what then?
Well, that would of course be a bit trying. Naturally, you know, polls are one metric by which people will go by. But at this stage, you'd have to say that Malcolm has the support of the party room. There's really no prospect of anyone else. Malcolm has done a good job in a challenging environment with the lack of any Senate majority, in fact far from it, managed to negotiate some pretty important bills through. I think he's,
Yeah, Amanda, look, taking your point at face value that there are a small number of rusted-on hardline Conservatives who would prefer to see Tony Abbott there and continuing to criticise Malcolm Turnbull's leadership, and taking what David's had to say there, that he enjoys broad support within the party, why then does he not use that more effectively? Because again, that's the criticism, that he has not stared them down, that he has not taken on the Conservative.
No, I get you. Well, look, a couple of things. Can I say first about the polls? We talk about the news poll. The news poll, of course, allocates preferences according to how they were cast at the last election, whereas the Fairfax poll actually asks that question. So I think the Fairfax polls are a bit more reliable. And the Fairfax poll shows that a huge portion of the coalition want Malcolm to stay, but more importantly, show that a vast majority of Australians want Malcolm to stay.
So why does he not use that more effectively? Because that's been the criticism, that he has disappeared. You know, you hear this phrase, he has shrunk in the office.
I just don't think that's right. But look, let me come back to the question of the Conservatives. I think, I can't speak for Malcolm, but looking from the outside, it seems to me that he recognises that there are people in Australia who think in a much more conservative way than myself or Tim or whoever else you might talk to. They're entitled to their view, they're entitled to air their view. And we all have to work together. That's something Malcolm understands. Whereas my own impression of the Abbott years was he had a view that everyone should agree with him, and that's why it became chaotic. So Malcolm's prepared to bring everybody together, to work together as a team. And I think he's not out to sort of crush the Conservatives. He accepts they're entitled to a view. What they're not entitled to do is get elected on a Liberal platform and then undermine the Liberal Party.
But Tim, John Howard has spoken about this, the need for unity, and when he was Prime Minister, and of course he went through a rough period as well, as we saw before, 18% in his opinion poll at the lowest. He battled the wets and the dries, the same Conservatives and Liberals, and he talked about a broad church. But that was John Howard, and he was able to deliver that. Is it fair to say that Malcolm Turnbull has not shown yet that he has delivered that there is still a hard, maybe small, but there is still a hardline Conservative rump there, and that they do not, and they warn that they are losing votes to the likes of One Nation, Pauline Hanson and others, that he has not brought that Conservative side with the other side of the Liberal Party into that broad church?
Well, one of the great strengths, Dan, of the Liberal Party is it's the only party that seeks to represent the whole of the nation. Every other political party, and I include even our coalition partners, the National Party, they're set up to represent a section of society. The National Party talks about how they're for regional Australia and the regions. The Labor Party is there traditionally for public, for blue-collar workers. Traditionally these days it's more public sector workers. The Liberal Party is the only party that turns around and says we're here to represent the whole of the nation and achieve the aspirations of the whole nation.
That can be a curse as much as a blessing.
Well, it creates challenges because what you actually have is everybody in one place and you'll get diversity of opinion. But I see the issue slightly differently. A lot of people are talking in the language still of the Cold War, the left and the right, the Conservatives and the Liberals. I think you'll find over the next decade that the divide that's going to appear in Australian politics, as it's appearing in the United States, as it's appearing in the UK, is actually around generations. And that generational politics is going to be what defines the attitudes of different political parties. And this is one of the great misunderstandings about what Bill Shorten's doing at the moment. Everybody's saying he's going to the left. Actually, he's going young. That's what he's doing. And the task for the Liberal Party is to go across or transcend those divides.
I'm glad you raised that, because that moves on to the next part of the discussion. The trend internationally is not just generational, it is cultural. And we are seeing real cultural divides here from those who feel left behind and those they view as the elites. And we've seen a rise of populism around that. I want to go to you, David, and then come to Amanda on some specific policy areas around this. But David, Do you think that we are going to continue to see this disaffection with the two major parties, people looking for alternatives, third-party alternatives, minor parties, independents, and we're going to see that continue to grow towards the next election?
Well, there has been a bit of a narrative around the rise of the minor party, disaffection with the major two. There might have been a little bit of a crimp in that in a few recent elections where, you know, the Liberals got in South Australia and Tassie. Nick Xenophon fell at the hurdle. But I think you're identifying in your earlier part of your question a genuine phenomenon around, you know, elites versus non-elites. There's been some categorisation of that between anywheres and somewheres, which is people who are comfortable, the anywheres, they'd be happy living in Sydney or New York or Paris, wherever, whereas most people probably are somewheres, they're rooted somewhere in a community with more traditional values. So this is quite an interesting phenomenon that's going on that's affecting Australia as well as other countries. I think there are, I mean, you referred to before to the rump of Conservatives, which was a bit disparaging because depending on the issue, there are a lot of conservative issues that are actually mainstream held across border protection and
when I referred to rump, I
immigration.
was picking up on what Amanda had to say about the number, not the broader support for the issues. But look, can I go to Amanda on this cultural question? Because we see it played out now in policy. Immigration, your former portfolio, is seen as a cultural battleground, and it is internationally as well. It's been one of the really strong issues that has driven a lot of the populism that we're seeing in other parts of the world. And Donald Trump tapped into that. We saw it a bit in the Brexit vote. We're also seeing it in energy policy here as well. Those supporting coal versus renewables, not just an economic issue, but seen as a cultural issue. Again, for Malcolm Turnbull, who in the anywheres and somewheres definition that David was talking about would be a cosmopolitan anywhere, how does he speak to those cultural issues that Tony Abbott and others seek to tap into?
Well, I'm not sure that Abbott does, actually. I have a sort of slightly different view on this, Stan. I think the managerial class, I like to call them, I think elite overstates their position in the world, need to really start to have a good look at themselves, as do so-called intellectuals, and say, look, do we really believe in democracy? Do we really believe that every man and woman has a right to express their view and have their say? And if we do, then we should be listening to what they say. But the managerial class has turned itself into something that wants to tell everybody what they ought to think and what they ought to do. And I think that's the nub of the problem. It's true on the left, it's true on the right. Doesn't matter if you're Conservative, moderate, Labor, whatever. There's too many in the managerial class who are not listening to what I call normal people think.
And Tim, this would take us back to where we started the conversation. I know it seems to go in circles here, but there is a reason for the 30 opinion polls. There is a reason that Malcolm Turnbull is, despite all of the achievements that you've gone through tonight, is losing personal support as well, because maybe he's identified as the managerial class. Maybe he's not seen as speaking to those issues that those people are concerned with, that David touched on as well. And if you're looking at trying to break that cycle, you've got to have that ability to achieve that.
Well, I think part of the problem is we've got caught into the cycle of politics, and frankly, the whole discussion around the 30 News poll is a classic example of this. You know, basically, no constituent has really raised this issue with me.
Exactly.
They actually don't care. They actually want the government to focus on them, and that's where everyone needs to focus their efforts if they want to be relevant. But Amanda is critically point, and it's one of the things that, as a local federal MP, you're constantly reminded all politics is local, but spend as much time engaging and listening directly to your own constituents. And what do they care about? Housing affordability is a huge issue. Tax reform, particularly it's the role it has in terms of people's lives and the stability and security they want, is critical. We actually face a huge challenge, and it comes back to the point I was making before around generational divides, where we have the largest generation now is basically between the age of 18 and 35. The second largest is over 65 or 55 to 75. And those people, the younger people want opportunity, the older people want security. But in many ways, the entire system of our economy and particularly our tax system is structured to give the opposite to both groups. So these are the sorts of things that actually interest people, and they want to hear that from their elected representatives, and they want to talk to them about it.
Tim, I've only got 10 seconds left for a yes or no, but there've been a few people saying hypothetically today, if the Prime Minister's job was available, they'd be interested somewhere down the line. Is that something that, you know, a baton you carry in your backpack?
I agree with the other analysis, which is there are 150 members. All of them probably share it or harbour it quietly. I've always had a rule, which is if you go into politics wanting to be Prime Minister, you're probably going to have a disappointing career.
And if you go not wanting to be, you're not likely to get there either. So, look,
blame the mothers. They all tell their sons and
You're
daughters
all
that they
special.
should
My
be
mother
Prime
never
Minister.
told me I was going to be Prime Minister. I can assure
Tony
you
Abbott's
that.
mum did.
Yes, well, there are a few who would still like the job. Amanda Vanstone, lovely to talk to you. Tim Wilson,
Nice to
thank you
talk
for
to you,
being on the
Stan.
program. David Alexander, thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, David.